I don't do a whole lot of cross-cutting on a table saw. Instead, I use my miter saw, which is the perfect tool for that, as long as it's set up correctly and cutting accurately. But when I do need to cut on a table saw, it's generally something that's really small or something that's too wide for my miter saw. And for the really small stuff, I use my mini table saw sled. That allows me to hold the stock safely and make a very precise 90-degree cut. It can also be used for wider and thicker stock, but like I said, I generally do those types of cuts on my miter saw. Another type of cut that I usually do on my miter saw is angle cuts for miters and whatnot. But if you don't have a reliable miter saw and you don't really want to buy one, you don't have the space for it or whatever, I have a sled. This is what I call my precision miter sled. Now I changed the design slightly from when I first built this to include a full scale that goes all the way over to the other side. And this will give you accurate cuts throughout the range on both smaller stock and on wider stuff. And if you want to make one of these for yourself, I have plans available. There's a link in the description. Click that, it'll take you there. You can pick them up, and in a couple afternoons, you can have this jig up and ready to go to make ultra accurate cuts. There's also the traditional table saw sled, which is a good option. I no longer have one of those because, like I said, I typically use my miter saw for the narrower stuff. I also have my precision sled for more complex cuts. And for squaring up panels, say wide panels especially, I have this one right here. This is my Abrams style crosscut sled. And the way this works is it's very simple. It's just a 1/4-inch piece of plywood, has a cleat across the front that's squared properly. It also has a guide bar on the bottom that rides in the slot in your saw. And the difference with this one is that the cleat that you put the stock up against is on the front rather than the back. And that simplifies the jig, makes it more lightweight and easier to use. However, there is a downside with this. You can't cut panels in half with them. If you rip a panel, especially something heavy, down the middle with this type of sled, it can pinch on the blade. So therefore, it's only for squaring up panels by cutting a small amount off the end of the panel. Another method of making crosscuts, especially on smaller stock, narrower, thinner stock, is to use a miter guide that comes with most table saws. I don't have one of those, especially not one that fits this saw. Instead, like I said, I rely on my mini table saw sled and also my precision miter sled on the things that I can't do on my miter saw. So that's the recommended ways to make crosscuts on the table saw. What about the ones that are not recommended? Well, I remember back when I was working in construction, I had a table saw set up, and I heard this banging coming from the room that it was set up in. And I walked in and I saw a guy, he was cutting a 2x4 into little pieces by standing beside the saw and feeding the piece in up against the fence. And every time he made a cut, the ones that actually didn't go through kicked back and slammed against the wall behind the table saw. He didn't see anything wrong with this, of course. He just needed some pieces of short 2x4 to use. However, I knew that he was damaging my saw doing it. Every time you have a violent kickback like that, you risk bending or damaging the blade, also throwing things out of alignment. Certainly not the ideal situation for something that you want to rely on for precision. Another way that's not recommended is freehanding the cut. Like you got your 2x4 here, you're going to run it through like that, and you're going to wind up with a shorter piece, of course. However, that really runs the risk of binding on the blade and kicking back. I did see a guy doing that very thing. It wasn't my table saw this time, and he seemed to be doing it successfully. There is a way to do it so that you turn your hands away from there to open the cut as you're pushing it through. That makes it safer, although I really wouldn't recommend it. One of the more dangerous cuts you can do on a table saw is to try to cut a panel that's this size, maybe a little bit bigger, and put the short side up against the fence. That way, there's a greater chance that it'll rock or rack into the blade and cause a kickback. Also, you really need to know where to push on the stock so that it doesn't close on the back of the blade. I made a whole separate video on kickback, and there's a link to that in the description, and I cover that particular cut in detail there. Kind of similar to that is if you have a panel, say this size, and you need to make it about an inch shorter. So you put that up against the fence, you set your fence for 1 inch, and you attempt to cut that piece off the side over there. Now, once again, it can be done successfully. It's a combination of using a push stick on this side over here and the right pushing action on the other side. And that's a balancing act, because if you push too much on this side over here, it'll bind on the back of the blade and pinch and kick back. If you don't push enough and you're pushing more on the push stick side over here, it'll turn into the blade and kick back that way. The best way to trim a small amount off a panel like this is to use some kind of sled. The mini table saw sled, if it's small enough, the precision miter sled, or the Abrams style one is almost perfect for this type of cut.